Abolition is nothing new. It's been around for decades. But in the past few weeks, we've seen the movement gaining more traction than ever before. People across the world are calling for the systemic shutdown of the police and prison systems. My name is Arsh Gill, and I'm going to be discussing how the Canadian police and prison systems work to actively oppress Black and Indigenous peoples and why we need to shut these systems down. In order to understand the case for abolition, we have to acknowledge the origins of these systems. We live in a capitalistic society, and in every capitalistic society, there is this social hierarchy. At the top of the social hierarchy is the ruling class. This consists of the people with the power, influence, and wealth to control the ideologies of society. Because they're at the very top of this hierarchy, every institution and system in place works to benefit the ruling class. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy is what we call the working class. These are the underprivileged, marginalized people whose labor gets exploited by the working class. Why is it that capitalism works this way? Well, when capitalism first began emerging was also around the time when police began emerging. Because police are created with the intention to enforce obedience among the working class, so that the ruling class had this permanent source of exploitation. Let's look at it from a standpoint of an economic timeline. Capitalism would not exist without mercantilism, because mercantilism brought upon Western colonialism, which led to the transatlantic slave trade. Capitalism was birthed from chattel slavery. We see the first form of the ruling class in white slave traders and owners, and we see the forms of the working class in the enslaved peoples who were exploited for their labor and received no wages. As mentioned earlier, alongside capitalism came police. Except they weren't police back then, they were called slave patrols. Slave patrols existed throughout colonial North America and have laid the foundation for what we modernly know as the police. Now, more specifically, the RCMP used to be called the Northwest Mounted Rifles. This was an armed force used to suppress Indigenous uprisings and to manipulate First Nations leaders into signing treaties that would give up their land and force dependency upon the government. Well, why is any of that relevant now? Well, slavery was never really abolished. It was abolished in the form that we know it, but what really happened is that it was made legal in another form. We see this very clearly in the US, where mass incarceration is now modern-day slavery, because they have the 13th Amendment, which allows for involuntary servitude to serve as a punishment for a crime. We see the mass incarceration of Black and brown people in the US prisons. The only difference between the US and Canada is that we don't have a 13th Amendment. We do have the disproportionate percentages of Black and Indigenous peoples in our prisons. It's so disproportionate that criminologists call Canadian prisons the new residential schools. So how does this happen? Well, decades of discrimination and intergenerational trauma have created what we know as marginalized communities. And in these marginalized communities, there is a high presence of police. The police are funded great amount of money by the government to target Black and Indigenous peoples. Their high presence in marginalized communities is a pipeline to prison. When in prison, inmates are exploited for their labor, making as little as legally possible while the profits go to the government, who continues to fund the police, who continue to target Black and Indigenous people. Inmates in Canada do make money for their labor, around $5 to $6, but that's before deductions. So the government does everything that they can to take the wages back. They create inescapable financial obstacles that forcibly deduct an inmate's pay. The prisons don't provide sufficient food. They don't provide basic hygienic products. This forces inmates to spend their money on an inmate catalog, which has poor quality products listed for double the price it would cost outside in the community. Not only that, but prison labor is marketed as an opportunistic and rehabilitative way for an inmate to gain valuable employability skills. That's how it's marketed. But what they don't tell us is that when an inmate refuses to work, that largely affects their ability to get parole or to transfer to a lower security prison. As I mentioned earlier, decades of intergenerational trauma and discrimination in every institution in this country has led to offenders who, for the most part, engaged in criminalized behavior for the sake of their own survival. How do we fix this? Whenever there's a systemic problem, it's a common misconception that reform is the solution. Reform is not the solution. There's a reason why reform doesn't work. It's impossible to reform police or prisons because the history of police and prison is reform. As an institution, since their inception, the police has always upheld white supremacy. What reform does is it offers more policing, it offers more utilities, it offers more training. All that does is allocate more funds towards policing rather than funding and bringing up communities to prevent crime. Reform does nothing to address systemic issues in an inherently violent institution. And the idea of prison reform, it's fundamentally flawed because it surrounds the idea that cages keep us safe. When you're putting someone in a cage, you're cutting them off from connections, you're cutting them off from their loved ones and their support systems. The Bureau of Investigations has said that the number one predictor of whether or not someone will reoffend is if they have support from loved ones. When you put someone in a cage, you're limiting any real connections whatsoever. And then when these inmates are released, they lack resources and they lack that support system. Then they are once again led to be in vulnerable positions where they engage in criminalized behavior, thus putting them back into a cage. Prison is not correctional. Prison is a self-perpetuating cycle of harm and violence. So if we can't reform our current system, we have to create space for a new one. What abolition does is move away from reliance on prisons and police to solve every social problem, and instead look towards preventative alternatives. There are 3 pillars to abolition. 1. Moratorium. This is stopping the construction of new prisons. Number 2. Decarceration. This is releasing prisoners gradually based on the type of crime. Number 3. Excarceration. This is diverting people away from prisons by reducing contact with the police. The number one question that is asked when it comes to abolishing prisons is, well, how do we hold people accountable without prisons? There are countless proposed measures that surround restorative and transformative justice. However, there is a fraction of dangerous people who do pose a threat to society and need to be separated. The details for what that would look like are not finalized yet. Abolition is a gradual process, and that requires coming back to the drawing board. It will require reassessing and adapting. When it comes to police abolition, that looks like reducing police reliance by decriminalizing activities that are usually committed when vulnerable people become desperate. It also means investing in alternative emergency response teams. Police are not trained to deal with all the problems society asks them to solve. Many people also wonder what will happen to current officers. Will they lose their jobs? Not necessarily. Abolition provides the opportunity to retrain in another emergency response field, one that they may be better suited to work in. In general, abolition is a very misunderstood topic. The idea of less reliance on law enforcement scares many people. What more of us need to realize is that law enforcement does not protect the majority, but rather upholds the status quo for the ruling class. These are conversations that we need to begin having on a regular basis. While some of us have the privilege of learning about systemic racism, others live the effects of it every day. Thank you so much for listening to my capstone. Putting this presentation together was a very long journey, and it involved unlearning the history that has been taught to me because most of it was whitewashed. And I hope that, just like me, this project has been an educational tool for you. Thank you!